Welcome to Growth Hack by Poppy Digital. Tips and tricks to master the algorithms from industry insiders. Now here's your host, Julian Espinoza.
Welcome back to Growth Hack, where we break down marketing channels like Google, Facebook, Instagram, and show them how to make them work for you. Today's episode is on podcasting, but this is not the episode you're expecting. With my guest, we will try to convince you not to start that podcast. We will even try to convince you to drop the podcast you've been working so hard on. This may sound counterproductive, but hear me out. Putting tons of effort into something that isn't netting you or going to be netting you results is the opposite of a growth hack. So what about not starting a podcast as a growth hack? Well, we've all heard less is more. That is the case with podcast. Less and even not doing one is more. It frees you up to do the things that actually give you results. That all said, if your podcast isn't growing or you're considering starting a podcast, you need to listen to this episode first. Our guest is the one and only John Lee Dumas. If you don't know who John is, he is the founder and the host of the award-winning podcast Entrepreneurs on Fire. His show has over 100 million listens and 3,000 plus episodes. So if there's anyone to tell you to start a podcast, it's this guy. JLD has turned Entrepreneurs on Fire into a media empire that generates over 1 million listens every month and a 7-figure net annual revenue 8 years in a row. His first traditionally published book, The Common Path to Uncommon Success, is available at uncommonsuccessbook.com. Welcome to the show, John.
Julian, I am fired up to be here, brother.
So am I. Let's not wait and let's get right into it. So what we're going to be talking today about is podcasting and who shouldn't start a podcast. So I'm going to hit you with like the tough question right now. Who should not start a podcast?
Everybody should not start a podcast that does not have the best solution to a real problem in this world that they want to solve. If you launch a podcast just to launch a podcast, you are going to be a weak, pale imitation of the thousands of other podcasts that are already out there. But if you instead identify a real problem in this world that you want to solve, that is your podcast. You will win.
I love that. So what I hear a lot is we do a lot of these rooms where we bring in new podcasters who are about to start or have started, and their best answer they have is, I want to inspire others. Do you think that isn't sufficient enough and that's not clear enough?
Is inspiring others the best solution to a real problem? No. It's the 734th best solution to a real problem. So you'll fail, you will lose. You need a specific best solution to one single problem in this world. That needs to be what your podcast solves. If you can't do that, you can't succeed.
For the audience that's listening, let's give them an example of a show that you've recently heard about where it really does solve a problem, and then contrast that to a show that isn't super clear on its message and who it's solving the problem for.
I was just interviewed by Chandler Bolts just 10 minutes ago. He has a podcast that teaches authors the best way to launch their books as self-published authors. He has the best solution to a real problem. His best solution is his program, his process for teaching self-published authors to launch their book. It's a real problem. He has the best solution to it. He wins at a very, very high level. A great example of somebody who isn't winning at a high level, I'm launching this podcast because I want to inspire others. Like, not to jump on your comment, but I hear it all the time too, brother. I run Podcasters Paradise. I see so many podcasters come in. That's all they got. I just want to inspire others. You're going to lose every single time.
Right. Now, we've been looking at some data and looking at the numbers. Most podcasts, about 90% of podcasts don't make it past episode 7. Why do you think that's happening?
It's not happening because they are launching a weak, pale imitation of other successful entrepreneurs and other successful podcasters out there. And then they're like, wow, episode 1 was fun. That was cool. Episode 2, I'm starting to get a little bit better than episode 1, where I actually was really terrible now that I look back on it. Episode 4 and 5, okay, the fun's kind of starting to wear off because this is actually taking work. And my number 6 just canceled. And wait a second, it's episode 7 and I'm not making any money right now? How's that possible? I quit. That's what happens. That's the process for 90% of podcasters.
And great way to segue into my next question. It's like you knew what I was going to ask. Should you think about monetization prior to starting or during the phase? And what should you be thinking about when you think about monetization?
So if you want to monetize your podcast, there's only one way to do so. It's to launch a podcast that is solving a real problem to one specific solution. And if you are doing that at a very high level, you're going to grow an audience who knows, likes, and trusts you. That audience that knows, likes, and trusts you, they know, like, and trust you because you're giving them real solutions to real problems. And then you can ask them, what's your biggest struggle right now? What is you, my audience's biggest struggle right now? And they'll tell you their obstacles, their challenges, their struggles, their pain points. And then what do? You create the solution in the form of a product or a service or a community or coaching. And that's how you monetize. That's how you monetize a podcast. And it takes time. It takes significant time, energy, and effort to get to that point.
Now, we're going to hear this because this is advice that I pass on as well. We're going to hear people like, well, look at Joe Rogan or look at Reid Hoffman with Masters of Scale. What's your argument to that and they're bringing in brand deals?
Listen, if you were an MMA star and then you went on and starred on Fear Factor for a number of years, and then you launched a podcast back in 2008 and you have thousands of episodes under your belt and you're actually good at what you do, you're going to get a 9-figure deal from Spotify. If you don't fit that description, you're not going to. If you started one of the biggest social media platforms in the world called LinkedIn, or if you were part of the PayPal mafia and you have tens of millions, potentially even into the 8 figures or 9 figures of personal net worth, and people respect you because you are a master at scale, you will be able to do those things. If that does not fit your description, you won't. And every single person that says, look at those people, does not fit those descriptions and does not get those deals.
Lovely said. Moving into the final question for this episode, it's about distribution, right? And the big thing that we have is a lot of people are creating these shows. They're creating it under the context of I want to inspire others, and then they're faced with this distribution problem. So the question I get the most common after that is, how do I get this episode out? And when should you start thinking about distribution, prior to your show creation or after your show creation?
So I have a lot of people that say, John, how do I grow my audience? Which is like another way of asking about distribution. And, they say, should I run ads to my podcast? Should I market on social media? Should I do this? Should I do that? And I look at them and I say, listen, I'm not saying this to be mean. I'm saying this because it's true. Your podcast sucks. Your podcast sucks because you just started. We all suck when we start. My podcast, Entrepreneurs on Fire, sucked when I started. It was a bad podcast. I was a bad host. I didn't know how to interview. I didn't know what I was doing. Why am I going to market to that? Because any money I throw after that, any time and energy I put into that, people are going to come and listen. They're going to say, well, that's a crappy show. And then they're going to leave. And that's not what you want. You don't want people to come and listen to your show and leave. You want subscribers, evangelists, actual listeners. That's what you want. That's what you need. So how about instead of spending all of that time marketing, all of that bandwidth marketing, all of that money marketing, you spend all of that time, money, and bandwidth becoming better at your craft, becoming a better podcast host, actually honing your skills, not just being an amateur forever, but becoming a pro podcaster. That's your time best spent.
Final thoughts. What do you got for us? Before you start a podcast, what should you be thinking about?
Listen, before you start a podcast, you need to be thinking, is there a real problem in this world that I can create the best solution to? Have I sounded a little bit like a broken record on this? Yes, because it's true. And because if I say it once, you'll ignore it. If I say it twice, you'll ignore it. In fact, most of you will still ignore it right now when you hear it. But it's true. You need to think of the one thing that you're going to do better than anybody else in this world. When I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire, it was a podcast. I niched to a business podcast. Again, I niched to an interview business podcast, and I still wasn't even close to the best solution. So I niched again to the first daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs, which made it the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It was also the worst, but it was the only. How can you be the only?
Thank you so much for jumping on the show, John, and hope to have you back again soon. I don't usually do outros, but wow, what an episode. I hope you go back and listen to this episode again to really understand what John is talking about. Please share this episode with anyone who is struggling or considering starting a podcast. John is the most qualified person on the planet to tell you if you should start a podcast. If you're interested in his book, The Common Path to Uncommon Success, it's available now at uncommonsuccessbook.com. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week when we bring on the brilliant Chris Mercer to talk to us about Google Analytics and the future of our digital marketing efforts.